Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Apologies, because this episode did not come out according to the usual schedule. I'm usually able to record and post Wednesday evenings for broadcast about midnight GMT. That didn't work this week. It just was a very, very frantic, busy week. I just could not keep up with all the things I had to keep up with. I don't see any problem in the immediate future. I see this weekend as being absolutely fine. Just last 2-3 days, they got on top of me. I couldn't quite keep up, so I needed a little bit more time. But we're here now, and we're going to start by reviewing Chapter 11. So Chapter 11 begins with an epigraph, surprise, surprise. And this one comes from the prologue of Ben Jonson's play Every Man in His Humour, dated around 1598. Jonson was a contemporary of Shakespeare. I know for a lot of people that listen to these videos, that's going to be a bit, yes, we know. But I say it anyway because I never really know. People come to literature from all kinds of different directions. You don't necessarily start with the Elizabethans or medieval literature and work your way through chronologically. So for some people that might be an, oh, really? And for other people it'll be like, yep, got that. So if I say these things, it's not because I think everyone watching is learning all this for the first time. I'm just throwing it out there in case it's useful to some people. So back to Jonson. Jonson, even though he was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he does seem to have done fairly well in his day, it's interesting that probably there are some of you who don't know him as a playwright, because his plays don't feature as much on stage today. And I've only read random passages from Jonson's play myself. It's interesting, my university degree didn't require me to read an entire Ben Jonson play, although it required me to read a fair number of Shakespeare's. And I felt, just from reading those extracts, that Jonson, his poetry, his meter and his phrasing and his rhymes were very correct, very orderly. He had a very orderly poem. And if we read through this, I think you'll see that sense, that he keeps it very nicely to time. But deeds and language such as men do use, and persons such as comedy would choose, when she would show an image of the times, and sport with human follies, not with crimes. So you can see it's very nice, neat poetry, very nicely done, very tidy. And you know, the odd thing is that correctness, as admirable as it is, actually gets, for me, a little tedious to read. I felt that to get that correctness, Ben Jonson had to sometimes sacrifice clarity and sometimes sacrifice beauty. And I better be careful what I mean by that. I mean, you can find the whole play on Project Gutenberg, of course, so you can read it and judge for yourself. But I'm going to just give a couple of observations of why I think Jonson hasn't aged well or doesn't appeal so much to the modern ear as Shakespeare does. Although those of you who aren't wild about Shakespeare are going to go, well, you're going to have to really convince me here. Okay, well, hear it out anyway. Shakespeare, in contrast to Ben Jonson, Shakespeare cheated, really. Which sounds terrible. It wasn't quite like that. He cheated in order to get his rhymes and his rhythms, and for him, the usual poetic phrase of 10 beats, by which, if you don't know what I mean, I'm talking about a line of iambic pentameter. So 10 beats is da-dum, 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 da-dum. 10 beats, one off and one stressed, one off and one stressed, da-dum, 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 da-dum. For those of you who learned all this in English, so sorry, you're going to be like, oh, I don't need to hear this again. But bear with me, those who are new to it. So Shakespeare used iambic pentameter because it was considered to be a high form of verse. You can see that I believe Jonson's using it as well. But deeds and language such as men do use, and persons such as comedy would choose. You can see, you can hear it now when I stress it. The problem is, because Ben Jonson does it so correctly, you can hear the da-dum, 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 da-dum. And there's something about, you hear that over and over again. It starts to sound plodding and dull. What Shakespeare did was a little bit different. He did try to keep to iambic pentameter, but he messed around with it. So in order to make his 10-beat lines work, he would squish words, misspell them. He'd invent words, as we know. And he would also sometimes split a line of poetry between two characters. So one character would speak a 6-beat line, and then another character would reply with a 4-beat line, and that would constitute one line. And you might think, how could that make a difference? But it does, because I think what Shakespeare was thinking, and he was thinking ahead of his time without realizing it, was that what we as modern people would really want to hear is natural human speech. That poetry is fine, but that is, we don't all speak to each other in poetry. And so in the modern world, in modern theatre, we like to hear people speak as we think they probably would. And so Shakespeare messed a little bit with his poetry. And also what Shakespeare did, if he had scenes where characters appeared who were not noble born. Let's think of in Hamlet, if you know Hamlet, the grave digging scene. There's two men, they're two grave diggers, and they're having a conversation. They don't converse in anything like poetry. They converse in prose. And that is what makes the difference there, because Shakespeare would every once in a while just use prose, just have people speak in the cadence that they would normally speak without worrying about all this dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum rhythm or rhyming. Shakespeare often didn't trouble himself too much to rhyme, or his rhymes were stretched. At any rate, in my mind, it's those characteristics that give Shakespeare's lines life. They vivify it, because he was, without realizing it, he was seeing ahead to a time when we would value prose, perhaps, I don't think we value it more than poetry, but for realism, we prefer prose, because we think of prose as being real, and we probably think about poetry as being more artful or artistic, and therefore, contrived, invented. Whereas prose, we think of, well, that's just what comes out of our mouth without thinking. We think of poetry as no, that's something you sit down and really think about, if that makes any sense. And so when we hear a production of a play that is supposed to represent real life, I think we feel more affinity for the characters if they speak in prose, and to some degree, and I know those who don't like Shakespeare are thinking, they don't speak in anything like modern English. They don't speak in anything like modern English. But I think that that's only because of the time in which they were written. I do wonder what kind, if a talent like Shakespeare's and a mind like Shakespeare's could have been writing drama now, I would be interested to see those plays, because I think they'd be fascinating. If he still had the ability to create a story and to create characterizations and high drama, I think he'd be just as good today. But that's just me speculating and getting very much off topic. Let's try this again. Off topic, because this is Middlemarch. It's 1830s according to the book, 1860s if we were with the author. So let's carry on. The epigraph, because it's part of a prologue. Prologues were commonplace in Elizabethan and Jacobean plays, and they were delivered at the beginning of the performance. I am not really in the 19th century yet, am I? Never mind, bear with. But a prologue would have been delivered at the beginning of a play, and to some degree, it was probably delivered because Elizabethan theatres were incredibly noisy places, especially if you were down on the ground. You had hawkers moving through the crowd selling food, and there'd have to be transactions. Audiences would heckle the actors, talk to each other. There was no etiquette really. So if you managed to hear the prologue, which would happen maybe before things got a bit too restless and noisy, you would at least get a sketchy idea of the plot. Johnson's prologue isn't really doing this. This isn't telling us a story so much. Johnson's prologue is a little bit more like a newspaper opinion column, if you read the whole thing. And the column basically says that poets don't really like writing for the stage, and with the exception of Johnson, of course. And when they do, the plays are different. Those plays which are truly written in poetry, and he might be having a dig at Shakespeare. He's like, he doesn't quite write poetry, does he? But he says those plays that do focus on poetry are more focused on the beauty of the language and less on the use of spectacle and stage dressing, which probably was having a dig at Shakespeare, but probably having a dig at many other playwrights as well. And the poor groundlings who paid their penny must have despaired. If you're going to stand on a dirt floor in a packed noisy and smelly place for a couple of hours. I think it's fair to expect more than just pretty words, but Johnson felt differently. Anyway, if we come back to this epigraph being used at the beginning of chapter 11, I'm going to speculate that Eliot has chosen this snippet to indicate a shift to comedy in the classical and Elizabethan Jacobean sense, meaning that we're now about to enter a point in the book where we'll have complex interactions with a number of characters, and things will seem to go wrong for quite a bit, but in the end, everything will kind of be repaired. And also, usually at the end of comedies, we get a marriage as a way of underlining this whole idea of reconciliation and conciliation and coming together. So let's start now and read the first paragraph of the chapter, and then I'll make some comments. Lydgate, in fact, was already conscious of being fascinated by a woman strikingly different from Miss Brooke. I'll pause here. We ended chapter 10, if you remember, knowing that Mr. Lydgate was in two minds about Dorothea Brooke. He thought her an interesting combination of beauty and intellect, but he considered her to be too earnest. That was his quote, not his style. Chapter 11 is wanting us to understand that he was already fascinated with a woman who was strikingly different from Dorothea. Let's carry on from that. He did not in the least suppose that he had lost his balance and fallen in love, but he had said of that particular woman, "She is grace itself. She is perfectly lovely and accomplished. That is what a woman ought to be. She ought to produce, quote, the effect of exquisite music." We do not know what music Lydgate had in mind. If I think about pieces of music that really left an impression on me, if this is also true of Mr. Lydgate, I'm going to talk about the first time I heard Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. And by first time, I mean the first time anybody heard it. Because, of course, if you go back to 1975, I was 11 years old and I owned a transistor radio. And every weekend, I would hang out with my friend Jody. She lived just down the road. And we would either hang around in her bedroom if the weather was bad, or we'd be outside in her garden if the weather was good. And we'd listen to the top 20 countdown, which happened Saturday mornings on station CFUN, CFUN AM. And there were a lot of good songs in 1975. There were a lot of sweet, sad songs, a lot of songs in a country vein, Olivia Newton-John, a lot of R&B and pop numbers. And then suddenly, in October, there is a song that comes out of an AM radio, and it doesn't fit any music category, and it sounds like it was written by a time traveler from the 18th century, and it's telling this strange but very compelling story. Seems to be a murder, and uses words like Scaramouche and fandango, and it sounds as though there's a full choir recording in the studio, and So in other words, this was a song with this incredible operatic quality, completely different to everything else that had been on the radio for several years, for that matter. I think when a song is so out of the ordinary, so ahead of everything else and different from everything else, I think it kind of bypasses all your rational processes, and it just presses all your emotional buttons. So if I were taking Lydgate's feeling that a woman ought to produce the effect of exquisite music, I think what he's saying is a woman ought to bypass all your rational faculties and go straight to the back of your brain where you have more emotional responses. Plain women he regarded as he did the other severe facts of life, to be faced with philosophy and investigated by science. I love that. Lydgate has just lost the sympathy of a lot of women readers right now, because of course he's hoping for science to find a cure for ugly women. Ah, dear. Something did strike me though about this character sketch. A man like Lydgate would be such easy pickings for a beautiful woman with a certain predatory intelligence. She could play the dumb blonde, and that's reminding me of one of the few films I have ever seen, Addams Family Values, the one where Uncle Gomez is taken in by Debbie Jelinski, who's this blonde, buxom nanny, and she's already worked her way through several rich husbands and murdered them, and she thinks Uncle Gomez is going to be next. I guess I'm saying Lydgate would be the kind of man that could fall prey to that sort of woman. And now I'm going to read on. It says, but Rosamund Vincy, we have to remember this name, don't we, seemed to have the true melodic charm. So it's referring back to the music again. She's the one. She can write the music. And when a man has seen the woman whom he would have chosen, if he had intended to marry speedily, his remaining a bachelor will usually depend on her resolution rather than his. Now I'm convinced myself that Rosamund is probably going to be something dangerous. It's this word true, that she has the true melodic charm. You just think, oh, yeah, probably isn't. We are all good at this, aren't we, though, at picking up clues in the text. When someone makes a claim about a character being wonderful, we often think, okay, watch that one. But I'm convinced that because Eliot's narrator hints that if Lydgate marries Rosamund, it will be because she decides that they will. And that is an interesting thought that the narrator is having. The narrator is saying is that if you weren't intending to marry, but you see this woman and you just think, oh, God, I wish I could, then really all it's going to take is her hinting that she would like you to marry, and probably all your resolve to just wait a while before you get entangled in a relationship. That's probably just going to collapse. And so I think we're having hints here. And this is a good comedy opening. It's a good comedy opening. Young man doesn't intend to marry yet because, he's got some things to be getting done, and along comes astoundingly beautiful woman and completely unseats him so that he's not able to carry out his rational plan for his life. Anyway, onwards. Lydgate believed that he should not marry for several years, not marry until he had trodden out a good, clear path for himself away from the broad road, which was quite ready-made. He had seen Miss Vincy above his horizon almost as long as it had taken Mr. Casaubon to become engaged and married, but this learned gentleman was possessed of a fortune. He had assembled his voluminous notes, and had made that sort of reputation which precedes performance, often the larger part of a man's fame. Interesting. Compare how Mr. Casaubon has taken a wife. He's taken a wife when he's already built up or achieved a fortune by whatever means, and he has a reputation because of his scholarship. The narrator calls these achievements of wealth and status the larger part of a man's fame. That is, it's more important for a man in the 19th century to concern himself with these and concern himself later with the getting of a wife, which is interesting because by contrast, in the 19th century, the larger part of a woman's fame at the time was the man that she married. So marriage mattered much more to a woman. To a man, if he was working rationally, you should get your fortune and your reputation, then you get your wife. And so naturally you do want to hurry along and get the first two things. Otherwise, people didn't live that long. Remember, Casaubon's 42 and people are thinking, he won't be around long. There we go. 45. It wasn't unusual to die before your 50th birthday, not in the early 19th century. He took a wife, that is, Casaubon took a wife, as we have seen, to adorn the remaining quadrant of his course, and be a little moon that would cause hardly a calculable perturbation. Casaubon is being compared to a planet that has a satellite, a little moon. So every moon exerts some kind of gravitational pull, but the size of the moon determines how much. But of course, as Casaubon has already moved, I guess they're assuming this is a planet that only does one orbit itself. Never mind, it's not comparing like with like, but we play with the metaphor. So this is the planet that does, Casaubon is a planet that makes one orbit himself. Towards the latter quadrant of his orbit, he acquires a satellite, and that satellite has a certain gravitational pull. But they're saying that as he's waited all this time, it's unlikely that acquiring the moon now in the last quadrant is going to make an appreciable change or shift or difference to his life. Interesting how they say that. Now, let's go on. But Lydgate was young, poor, ambitious. He had his half-century before him instead of behind him, and he had come to Middlemarch bent on doing many things that were not directly fitted to make his fortune or even secure him a good income. Ooh, okay. To a man under such circumstances, taking a wife is something more than a question of adornment. Let's just stop there for a moment. And there's a good logic here from a 19th century point of view, but also I suppose you could argue from a modern point of view, except in a modern instance, you could say this applies to either partner. If Lydgate was older and he had wealth and an established career, then taking a wife at that point would be a different kind of action than taking one when he's younger and he's still taking his first steps, his first risks to get toward what he wants. If he takes a wife when he's younger and poorer, he has less capacity for handling the unexpected in a relationship. And by unexpected, we are usually talking about children. But there's lots of other things. There could be ill health, a loss of a fortune, or some kind of other financial setback. These things could pressure Lydgate into making a decision he otherwise would not. And that's true of all relationships in there. When two people get together when they're younger and don't have as much money, then yes, what happens in that relationship can really put pressure on whatever plans they had in place. So that's all that's really saying. It's like, oh, okay, to a man under Lydgate's circumstances, taking a wife is going to be something more. Taking a wife could mean that he isn't able to take the particular career path he wants, depending upon what happens. We shall see. We shall see. But let's just go back and read the sentence in full because it crosses over onto page 95. So I think it'd be better if we just get that whole sentence. To a man under such circumstances, that is Lydgate's circumstances, taking a wife is something more than a question of adornment, however highly he may rate this, and we know that he does. And Lydgate, it says, was disposed to give it the first place among wifely functions. As far as he was concerned, the most important thing about your wife is how good looking is she, because she needs to really be an adornment. To his taste, guided by a single conversation, here was the point on which Miss Brooke would be found wanting, notwithstanding her undeniable beauty. She did not look at things from the proper feminine angle. We're going to stop there because it's interesting what the narrator is suggesting too in this section, that the whole paragraph about Lydgate and his situation and whether he should marry. It's suggesting that it's a safer gamble to marry for looks if you have wealth and high status. That is to say, if you just look around and go, okay, who's good looking, and you're not too worried about other aspects of their character, you can get away with that more easily if you already have great wealth and status. But I think it's also hinting that if you don't have a lot of money or you are just starting out in your career, you might want to consider something else besides how good looking a woman is, because that woman is going to be probably instrumental in whether you can attain your ambitions. A woman who perhaps the only thing that is valuable about her is her looks may not be helpful in other ways, and that might be quite crucial depending upon what it is that you're trying to do. So an interesting angle that the narrator is taking there. But back to Dorothea, of course, apparently she wasn't looking at things from this proper feminine angle, and then the narrator goes on to explain, presumably, what Lydgate sees as the proper feminine angle. The society of such women, that is, as Dorothea, was about as relaxing as going from your work to teach the second form. In other words, you no sooner finish your job than you go on and you act as a teacher. Instead, this is apparently what you're supposed to do, and what women are supposed to provide you with when you do finish your work. Instead of reclining in a paradise with sweet laughs for bird notes and blue eyes for a heaven. Wow, okay. That's just lovely. We might call this Lydgate's theory of woman as recreational drug. That you need a wife to transport you outside reality. That's cool. It's astonishing naiveness, but then, he's young. Everybody is a bit naive when they're young. I wonder if the novel will tell us what his growing up was like. Like, how many women did he get to see on an everyday basis? So we'll go on. Certainly nothing at present could seem much less important to Lydgate than the turn of Miss Brooke's mind, or to Miss Brooke than the qualities of the woman who had attracted this young surgeon. But anyone watching keenly the stealthy convergence of human lots sees a slow preparation of effects from one life on another, which tells like a calculated irony on the indifference or the frozen stare with which we look at our unintroduced neighbor. Destiny stands by sarcastic with our dramatis personae folded in her hand. Ooh, okay, we seem to have got very, I was going to use the word meta. Certainly we've created this incredible metaphor at the end of Destiny standing by. But I think what the paragraph is beginning to talk about is the nature of comedy. The nature of comedy is a stealthy convergence of human lots, a slow preparation of effects from one life on another, which tells like a calculated. So in other words, what comedy often does when you think about it is it plays on people having one impression of how things are, but that's not. And that can be several different people having several different impressions. And there's usually some misunderstanding. They misapprehend what each other is actually like, misapprehend what someone means, or every time they try to do something, they fail because of some circumstance outside their control. So I think all this paragraph is describing is the nature of comedy. The nature of comedy is that no matter what the characters head into and think they're going to do, or no matter what impression they have of the other people that they meet, it's all going to get upended, and things are going to be misunderstood, or someone's going to make a misjudgment, and that's the game. It tells on those first impressions, the indifference or the frozen stare with which we look at our unintroduced neighbor. Can you think of a comedy situation where people begin almost as enemies, as foes, right at the start of the comedy situation? And then, of course, the events turn and turn and turn and turn, so that they realize that person that they thought was either totally unlike them or their mortal enemy turns out to be the best person they could possibly meet. If anybody wants to riff on this, please feel free. But I think all that Eliot's narrator is doing here is describing how comedy works. Comedy is this strange mechanism that makes a story, and it usually has to start with a mistake, a misunderstanding, a misjudgment, a miscalculation of some sort to get the ball rolling, turn it upside down so that they can be then put all right side up again and everything's happy and joined up at the end. To say, though, that Destiny stands by sarcastic with our dramatis personae folded in her hand is a little dark. I just imagine this creature, behind a stage curtain thinking, yeah, you think this is what's going to happen. Well, I'm going to send some other people out on stage and you're going to be surprised. So that Destiny image was a tiny bit creepy. It made me think of to some degree the effects in Mill on the Floss, because Maggie Tulliver, the protagonist in The Mill on the Floss, is often described in Gothic terms. She was cast, you can have adjectives that describe her as demonic and witch-like, and of course the river, the Floss that flows past her childhood home, that river had a power that seemed to be tied to Maggie, and Maggie tied to the river. There's almost a pagan kind of power. So Middlemarch is a very sensible and starched novel when you compare it to The Mill on the Floss, which had a lot more Gothic stuff going on, and therefore to see this one little sentence about Destiny standing by with these people folded in her hands like she has the power is bringing something into Middlemarch that it was not really, we haven't seen it in the book up till now. Reading on, old provincial society had its share of this subtle movement, had not only its striking downfalls, its brilliant young professional dandies who ended up living an entry with a drab and 6 children for their establishment, but also those less marked vicissitudes which are constantly shifting the boundaries of social intercourse and begetting new consciousness of interdependence. Some slipped a little downward, some got higher footing. People denied aspirates, gained wealth, and fastidious gentlemen stood for boroughs. Some were caught in political currents, some in ecclesiastical, and perhaps found themselves surprisingly grouped in consequence, while a few personages or families that stood with rock firmness amid all this fluctuation were slowly presenting new aspects in spite of solidity, and altering with the double change of self and beholder. Municipal town and rural parish gradually made fresh threads of connection. Gradually, as the old stocking gave way to the savings bank, and the worship of the solar guinea became extinct, while squires and baronets, and even lords who had lived blamelessly afar from the civic mind, gathered the faultiness of closer acquaintanceship. Now that's a hell of a paragraph. That's a lot being said. And actually, you could call that paragraph, I would say, a summing up of Middlemarch, because I think that is what this novel intends to cover, is all aspects of the changing English society. So we could maybe go through this bit by bit. Okay, so we've talked about old provincial society had its share of subtle movement, that is, movements within society. It talked about striking downfalls, a brilliant young professional dandy who ended up living in an entry. An entry, I think, is just a very small dwelling with a drab. A drab, I'm afraid, just means slut. Think of now, who was Elizabeth Bennet's sister who married Captain Wentworth? Not Wentworth. See, I'm getting it mixed up with Persuasion. You'll know the girl that I mean, right? Ran off, eloped, with the whole reason for Elizabeth and Darcy probably finally solidifying their relationship. But that's the kind of relationship I mean. You know, a man who has all these career prospects, but he doesn't make much of them. He marries an unsuitable woman. Before you know it, they've got a load of children and he can't afford to keep them. And they're living in a terrible little place. So, okay, so there are big downfalls like that. And then they also said less marked vicissitudes. In other words, tiny misfortunes and things, which are constantly shifting the boundaries of social intercourse, the text says. Yeah, they are. Because people who once had money are maybe slowly slipping down, and people who didn't have money are slowly slipping up. This was a time when there was some movement socially and constantly shifting the boundaries of social intercourse. Yes, because as some people slipped downwards, they weren't able to stay within their class. People would stop interacting with them as they could see wealth diminishing. And similarly, if you were acquiring wealth, you were coming into new groups of people. Some slipped a little downward. There we go. Some got higher footing. There we are. People denied aspirates. Now, in other words, denied their aspirations for one reason or another, or gained wealth. And fastidious gentlemen stood for boroughs. That's talking politics. In other words, men got themselves involved in local politics as a way of gaining fame and notoriety. Some were caught in political currents, yeah, because there were a lot of political currents at this time, and we've discussed some of them. Some in ecclesiastical currents, yes, that too, of course, we've noted about Catholic emancipation, and perhaps found themselves surprisingly grouped in consequence. Now that's a tricky thing. You sort of think, what on earth does that mean? I think what it means is if you are going to get involved in political debate or trying to make changes to something political or something ecclesiastical, you're probably going to make some interesting friends and interesting enemies. People are going to be your allies that you didn't expect to be your allies, or you're going to find yourself having to agree with someone that you don't agree with on a lot of other things, because the one thing you do agree about is a thing that you want to change. Well, a few personages or families that stood with rock firmness were slowly presenting new aspects in spite of solidity, and altering with the double change of self and beholder. Wow, that is a point of Hegelian philosophy, the double change of self and beholder. And you'll forgive me, I tried reading an article that discussed Eliot's acquaintance and knowledge of Hegel, and I just thought philosophy is a subject that repeatedly defeats me. I will try and find the article and put it in my description box if you're more interested in that. Municipal town and rural parish gradually made fresh threads of connection. Yeah, gradually, they said, as the old stocking gave way to the savings bank, and there were a lot of banks begun at this point in England. And the worship of the solar guinea became extinct. That's a particular reference to a change in the currency that happened after the Napoleonic Wars. There was a looking again at currency, and new coins were issued. And it was also because English currency for a long time was very easy to forge, very easy to counterfeit. So these were the beginnings of attempts to make money more difficult to forge and counterfeit as well. And while squires and baronets and even lords who had lived blamelessly afar from the civic mind gathered the faultiness of closer acquaintanceship. That would probably be because of journalism. So people would begin to get more reports, and reports of the failings of any of these great families would spread wider. That could be quite a different effect on their lives than if only people knew it locally. But I wonder if the book isn't going to work with all these things. It already feels as though it's working with some of them. And so I think this is a fascinating paragraph. You were highlighting this. I would put a note at the beginning of Middlemarch to refer to this paragraph to go, if you want to understand possibly what Middlemarch is really trying to deal with throughout its whole 800 pages, it would be this paragraph, I think. Carrying on, settlers too came from distant counties, some with an alarming novelty of skill, others with an offensive advantage in cunning. I know it says coming from distant counties, and this is true. We were beginning to see the movement of people, especially as industry began to build up in the larger cities. This was the beginning of that movement. Also, I think what isn't mentioned here is that we also got a lot of settlers from distant countries around this time. There was a lot of immigration to England from Germany and Russia. If you've been listening to the videos that I did about 1812 and the March on Moscow, you'll know that the whole of Central Europe, and of course that involved all the states that became Germany, they were economically constrained by Napoleon's continental system. And this was the policy which made war on Britain by preventing the movement of goods by sea between England and virtually the whole of Europe. While it had an effect on Britain, yes, it had a much worse effect on the German and the Polish states, and indirectly also on Russia. Some German businessmen and inventors, young men, began to believe that maybe it would be more advantageous to emigrate, and a number of these men became instrumental in the development of major industries in England. I'd like to share a web page. It's actually a link to an online booklet about German influence on early 19th century industry. And I'm just going to put up one page. It's going to take over the whole screen. And even then, I couldn't get the whole page on, but I'm focusing on the couple of paragraphs that end this page, where it says, Britain's 19th century industrial might owes much to German entrepreneurs. In 1873, the chemist Ludwig Mond, together with his Swiss partner John Brunner, built a soda ash plant at Northwich in Cheshire, the start of what was to become Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI. Earlier in the century, two German chemists, Friedrich Winzer from Brunswick and Friedrich Acum from Buchenberg, had built London's first gasworks. Their gas, light and coke company eventually became British Gas. And the giant engineering firm Siemens traces its origins to the Siemens brothers from Laon, who opened an experimental steelworks in Wales in 1868. So that just shows that there was people coming in from other countries as well and bringing their intelligence, or as the narrator puts it, half sarcastically, the offensive advantage in cunning. Now, I've almost lost where we were. Yes, we were on the bottom of page 95. In fact, much the same sort of movement and mixture went on in Old England as we find in older Herodotus. Now, I am so sorry, everyone. I have not read Herodotus' histories, and I tried to get a quick sort of idea of how Herodotus might have something to say about movement and mixture of peoples. I couldn't really find anything quickly. I've gone ahead and put the histories on my wish list. I think I really should read that. I'll just assume, of course, that Herodotus, since he was dealing with the wars between the Persians and the Greeks, just reported on the movement of people, the migration that often happens during a war. That's all I can say. It says, who also, in telling what had been, thought it well to take a woman's lot for his starting point, though Io, as a maiden apparently beguiled by attractive merchandise, was the reverse of Miss Brooke, and in this respect perhaps bore more resemblance to Rosamond Vincy, who had excellent taste in costume, with that nymph-like figure and pure blondness. No, we use true in the perfect. This is pure blondness, true melody, and pure blondness, which gave the largest range to choice in the flow and color of drapery. This says so much about Rosamond. She's just something to get dressed. But these things made only part of her charm. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm misjudging. Let's keep reading and see what else we can learn about Miss Vincy. She was admitted to be the flower of Mrs. Lemon's school, the chief school in the county, okay, where the teaching included all that was demanded in the accomplished female, even to extras such as the getting in and out of a carriage. Wowee. Mrs. Lemon herself had always held up Miss Vincey as an example. No pupil, she said, exceeded that young lady for mental acquisition and propriety of speech, while her musical execution was quite exceptional. Well, that makes sense, because the metaphorical sense that Lydgate speaks of, that a woman should be like exquisite music, well, apparently Miss Vincey was even musical, to add to that. We cannot help the way, the text says, in which people speak of us. And probably, if Mrs. Lemon had undertaken to describe Juliet or Imogen, these heroines would not have seemed poetical. The first vision of Rosamond would have been enough with most judges to dispel any prejudice excited by Mrs. Lemon's praise. Okay, I don't know what to make of that last comment. I presume it to mean that Rosamond she's just drop dead gorgeous. Naturally, she just got all the right DNA, and so men would usually be willing to overlook a lot of her faults very quickly, and they wouldn't need Mrs. Lemon's help with all her recommendations and about how wonderfully mentally acquisitive. I'm not sure they'd care. Well, Lydgate is the kind of man who seems to say, I'm not bothered. Does she look pretty? Lovely. We'll have that. And that's where I think we can end this bit, because we've done our piece. I think we've done our 2 and a bit more pages. And I think now we're just going to head more into talking about Rosamond. So we're going to transition again. We talked a little bit about Lydgate and his situation. Now it seems the book is going to turn, and we're going to take a closer look at Rosamond. So I will leave that for next time. Thanks everybody for tuning in. And again, sorry I'm late, but we are going to resume regularly scheduled programming at the weekend. So I'll see you again then. Okay. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.